Hi, this is Miss Terry, and we're going to go over Unit 7, Chapters 8 and 9, the skeletal and muscular system. The skeletal system gives us our basic body shape. As you know, the lower extremity bones support the weight of the body. The bones support and protect the soft body organs. And with help from the muscles, the skeletal system enables the body to move about. Bones store a number of minerals, the most important calcium and phosphorus, which you know, and then red bone marrow is produces the blood cells from the red bone marrow of the bones. Bones are classified as long, short, flat, irregular. Long bones, they're longer than they are wide, such as the femur, which is the thigh, and the humerus, which is the arm. And even the metacarpals and the finger bones are considered long bones. The short bones are shaped like cubes and found primarily in the wrists and ankles. The flat bones are thin, flat, and curved. They form the ribs, the breastbone, cranium, and bones of the shoulder. The irregular bones are differently shaped and are not classified as long, short, or flat. They include the hip bones, the vertebrae, and various bones in the skull. Bones is also called osseous tissue, and the process of bone formation is called ossification. Bone cells are called osteoblasts, and they secrete an intracellular matrix containing calcium, other minerals, and protein fibers. The osteoblasts mature into osteocytes that sit within the hard bone matrix and maintain the bone. So that's how bone tissue and bone is formed. There are two types of bone, compact and spongy. Compact refers to the dense, hard bone tissue found primarily in the shafts of the long bones and on the outer surfaces of other bones. So that's compact. Spongy bone is less calcareous. Bone is less dense. Spongy bone is located primarily at the ends of the long bones and in the center of other bones. Please look at figure 8.3, which is the anatomy of a long bone. Sponge bone has a much different structure than compact bone. Spongy bone, the bone tissue is arranged in plates called trabeculae. These bony plates are separated by holes that give a spongy bone a Swiss cheese appearance. The holes are important for two reasons. They decrease the weight of the bone, and they contain red bone marrow. So that is in the spongy bone. For your test and just general knowledge, you will need to know the parts of the long bones, and those are in your textbooks. The diaphysis, the epiphysis, the epithelial disc, the medullary cavity, the periosteum, and the articular cartilage. So you need to know all of that. The diaphysis is the long shaft of the bone. It is compact and enables for the strength of the bone. The epiphysis is the enlarged ends of the long bone, and they consist of a layer of compact bone overlying spongy bone. The epithelial disc is growing long bone containing a band of hyaline cartilage located near the proximal and distal ends of long bones. Be sure you know that. Epithelial disc. It's at the distal ends of the long bones. This band of cartilage is the epithelial disc or growth plate. It is here that longitudinal bone growth occurs. So if a child injures the epithelial disc, the longitudinal bone growth can be impaired. So if they break their bone early in their life, they can have a problem with bone growth. The medullary cavity is the hollow center of the diaphysis. It is filled with yellow bone marrow and functions as a storage site for fat. In infancy, the cavity is filled with red bone marrow for blood cell production. The periosteum is a tough fibrous connective tissue membrane that covers the outside of the diaphysis. Remember, that was the the diaphysis is the long shaft of the bone. So this periosteum is the part that covers that long bone. It is anchored firmly to the outside of the bone on all surfaces except the articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is found on the outer surface of the epiphysis. It forms a smooth, shiny surface that decreases friction within a joint. So like your hip bone in the hip joint, it decreases that friction in that ball and socket joint. So be sure and go in there in your textbook now and review figure 8.3. That should give you the description of that we just went through. Ossification is the process of bone formation. It begins in late embryonic period of formation of the fibrous connective tissue. In the fetus, the flat bones, like those in the skull, consist of thin connective tissue membrane. Ossification begins when osteoblasts, or bone-forming cells, migrate to the region of the flat bones. The osteoblasts then secrete calcium and other minerals into the spaces between the membrane, thereby forming the bone. The skeletal system has divisions, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeletons. Please look at figure 8.1 in your textbook. You will need to know the major bones: the cranium, the mandible, the clavicle, the scapula, the humerus, the sternum, the costal cartilage, the ulna, the radius, the carpals, the coxal, which is the hip bone, the sacrum, the femur, the patella, the tibia, the fibula, the tarsals, and the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. I kind of walked you head to toe. But you will need to know those divisions of the skeletal system. The axial skeleton are the bones of the cranium, the face, the middle ear bones, the hyoid bone, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax. The appendicular skeleton includes the pelvic girdle, the upper extremities, and the lower extremities. So know the difference between those two divisions of the skeletal system. There are 206 bones in the body. The facial bone has 14 bones, most of which are paired. The mandible is the lower jawbone and carries the lower teeth. The lower portion of the mandible forms the chin. The mandible forms the only freely movable joint in the skull. Here. Please study figure 8.7 and know the bones of the skull. Remember, an infant has fontanelles or soft spots. This area of their skull has not yet been converted to bone. Infants also have unfused sutures to allow the skull to be compressed during birth and allow for continued growth of the brain and skull after birth and throughout infancy. The vertebrae has atlas C1 and axis C2. The first and second cervical vertebrae have several special features and names. The first cervical vertebrae, C1, is called the atlas. The atlas has no body, but does have depressions into which fit the bony projections of the occipital bone of the skull. The atlas supports the skull and allows you to nod yes. The atlas is named after a figure in Greek mythology which carried the earth on his shoulder. The second cervical vertebrae is called the axis, A-X-I-S, and has a projection called the dens, which fits into the atlas and acts as a pivot or a swivel for the atlas. The axis allows your head to rotate from side to side and say no. So shaking a baby can easily dislocate the dens, causing injury to the spinal cord and the brain. So you can think about that now, that shaken baby syndrome will injure that C1 and C2 very easily. The thoracic cage. The thorax is a term that refers to the chest region. It is composed of the sternum, the ribs, and thoracic vertebrae. The xiphoid process is the tip of the sternum that serves as the point of attachment for some abdominal muscles. I'm sure you studied the xiphoid process when you did your CPR training, because you search for that and then place your hands right above it. The suprasternal notch, or the jugular notch, is a depression on the upper part of the mandible between the two clavicles and is used as a landmark. There are 12 pairs of ribs, and they attach posteriorly to the thoracic vertebrae. Anteriorly, the top 7 pairs of ribs are attached directly to the sternum by the costal cartilage and are called true ribs. The next 5 pairs attach indirectly to the sternum by cartilage or do not attach at all and are called false ribs. The bottom 2 pairs of false ribs lack sternal attachment and are therefore called floating ribs. The floating ribs are the ones that are easily broken. The spaces between the ribs are called the intercostal spaces, and they're numbered. The ribs are numbered, which allows us to describe the location of thoracic structures. An example, the heart is located between the 2nd rib and the 5th intercostal space, the space between the 5th and 6th ribs. So throughout your nursing career, you will learn landmarks that you describe according to the ribs or the intercostal space. There are also descriptions called lines and angles. You will need to know the definitions of the mid-sternal line, the mid-clavicular line, costal margins, costal angle, and angle of Louis. You will hear physicians speak of these lines and angles, and that is described in figure 8.13. Some terms are pronation and supination. Now, I think you've already had this. They refer to the hands. They're pronated or supine. The appendicular skeleton, pronation. In the appendicular skeleton, pronation is palms down. Supination is palms up. Imagine that most of our weight is supported by 2 of the tarsal bones, the talus and the calcaneus. The toe contains 14 phalanges. The great toe is called the hallux, H-A-L-L-U-X. Moving on to joints. A joint or an articulation is the site where 2 bones meet. Joints perform 2 functions. They hold the bones together and they provide flexibility to a rigid skeleton. Without joints, we would walk rigidly. Joints are classified as immovable, which are like sutures in the skull, and slightly movable. Spinal column occurs at the intervertebral disc, and the symphysis pubis allows the pelvis to widen for birth. So those are slightly movable joints. Freely movable allow much more flexibility and movement, so most of the joints of the skeletal system are freely movable. These joints are known as synovial joints, and these are described in Table 8.3. Also look at Figure 8.21, which are the types of movements at joints: flexion, extension, eversion, inversion, abduction, adduction, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, hyperextension, extension and flexion, circumduction. So make sure you understand all of those terms. That was pretty rapid on the skeletal system. This is a unit that includes only 2 chapters, so you will need to know most of the information in these 2 chapters to cover for your tests. Moving on to Chapter 9, the muscular system. There are 3 types of muscles: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Smooth muscle is discussed throughout the book, and the cardiac muscle is discussed in chapters 16 and 17. So this chapter focuses mostly on skeletal muscles. As a review, though, smooth muscle is generally found in the walls of the viscera, such as the stomach, and is called visceral muscle. It is also found in tubes and passageways such as the bronchioles, breathing passages, and blood vessels. Because smooth muscle functions automatically, it is called involuntary muscle. Unlike skeletal muscles, smooth muscles do not appear striped or striated, and is therefore they are called non-striated muscles. Cardiac muscle is found only in the heart. Skeletal muscle then is generally attached to bone. Because skeletal muscle can be controlled by choice, it is called voluntary muscle. So that I choose to move my leg, I choose to move my arm. The skeletal muscles are long, shaped like cylinders or tubes, and composed of proteins arranged to make the muscle appear striated or striped. Skeletal muscles produce movement, maintain body posture, and stabilize our joints. They also produce considerable heat and therefore help maintain body temperature. If damaged, skeletal muscle has a limited capacity for regeneration. A large skeletal muscle is surrounded by layers of tough connective tissue called fascia. The outer layer is called the epithelium. Another layer is called the perimysome. The bundles of muscle fibers are called fascicles. Individual muscle fibers are found within the fascicles and are surrounded by a third layer of connective tissue called the endomysium. The epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium extend toward and attach to the bone as a tendon. Make sure you remember that. They all extend and attach to the bone as a tendon. A long cord-like structure that tendon is. In the limbs, the extensive amount of fascia separates the muscles into isolated sections or compartments. Muscle attachments. Muscles form attachments to other structures in three ways. The tendon, which we discussed above, attaches the muscle to the bone. Muscles attach directly without a tendon to a bone or to soft tissue, and there is a flat sheet-like fascia called aponeurisis, and it connects muscle to muscle or muscle to bone. So that's the three different forms of attachments. Either they attach the muscle to the bone, the muscle attaches directly without a tendon to a bone or soft tissue, or there's a flat sheet-like fascia that connects muscle to muscle or muscle to bone. Structure and function of a single muscle fiber. The muscle fiber has more than one nucleus and is surrounded by a cell membrane called a sarcolemma. Each muscle fiber is composed of long cylindrical structures called microfilaments. Each myofibril is made up of a series of contractile units called sarcomeres. So each myofibril is made up of a series of contractile units called sarcomeres. Each sarcomere extends from Z-line to Z-line and is formed by a unique arrangement of contractile proteins referred to as thick and thin filaments. The thin filaments extend toward the center of the sarcomere from the Z-lines. The thin filament is composed of two proteins called actin. Make sure you know that. And the troponomyosin complex. The actin contains binding sites for the myosin. The thicker myosin filaments sit between the thin filaments. Extending from the thick myosin filaments are structures called myosin heads. There is a section in your textbook called Ramp It Up that is right here where all of these the muscle fibers are discussed, and it is about the troponin-myosin complex and calcium, and kind of sums it all up for you. Be sure and read that. So make sure you know about actin and how that all works to compose the muscle fibers. The neuromuscular junction, the area where the motor neuron meets the muscle, is called the neuromuscular junction. So where the motor neuron talks to the muscle is called the neuromuscular junction. 4 steps are involved in the transfer of information from the neuron to the muscle at the neuromuscular junction. Make sure you know this. First, there's stimulation of the neuron causes an electrical signal or nerve impulse to move along the neuron toward the ending of the neuron. Stored within its ending are vesicles or membranous pouches filled with a chemical substance called, and you've heard this before, a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction is acetylcholine, ACH, and we have discussed that in previous chapters. The nerve impulse causes the vesicles to move toward and fuse with the membrane at the end of the neuron. Acetylcholine is released from the vesicles into the space between the neuron and the muscle membrane. Acetylcholine diffuses across the space and binds to the receptor sites on the muscle membrane. The acetylcholine stimulates the receptors and causes an electrical signal to develop along the muscle membrane. So you remember what we talked about before, acetylcholine causes that electrical signal to develop. And then the textbook talks about some disorders of the neuromuscular junction. One is myasthenia gravis, and you may have heard about that before. It's a disease that affects the neuromuscular junction itself. The receptor sites are altered so that they cannot effectively bind acetylcholine, so they cannot create that nerve impulse. Consequently, muscle contraction is impaired and the person experiences extreme muscle weakness, myasthenia gravis. Neurotoxins on muscle function are their chemical substances, neurotoxins, we've talked about that in some way disrupt the normal function of the nervous system. Neurotoxins are produced by certain bacteria. For example, Clostridium tetani secretes a neurotoxin that causes excessive firing of the motor nerves. This in turn causes excessive release of acetylcholine. Instead of impairing it, it causes excessive release, overstimulation of the muscle membrane, and severe muscle spasms and tectonic contractions, hence the name tetanus. Because of muscles of the jaw are the first muscles affected, the disease is often called lockjaw. You've heard that. That's from Clostridium tetani. A second neurotoxin is Clostridium botulinum. The bacterium appears in food, and we hear about that. It seems like every day on the news something is recalled due to botulism. And food has been improperly processed. See figure 9.4 for a better understanding of this process, which is from botulism. So muscle responses. These include the responses that characterize a single muscle fiber and responses of whole muscles. So there's twitch and tetanus. If a single electrical stimulus is delivered to a muscle fiber, the fiber contracts and then fully relaxes. This single muscle response is called a twitch. However, if the muscle fiber is stimulated rapidly and repetitively, the muscle fiber has no time to relax and therefore remains contracted. Sustained contraction is called tetanus. This tetanus is different than the disease called tetanus, so make sure you remember that. We're not talking about the disease tetanus. Recruitment is when the whole muscle, not a single muscle, fiber is involved. So all of the muscles is involved. Muscle tone or tonus refers to normal, continuous state of partial contraction. And now in figure 9.5, we're going to review the steps in the electrical stimulation of skeletal muscle and its contractile response. So first, the electrical signal travels down the nerve, causing the release of the neurotransmitter ACH. The ACH diffuses across, remember, the neuromuscular junction and binds to the receptor sites. Stimulation of the receptor sites causes an electrical impulse to form in the muscle membrane and travel deep into the muscle through the T-tubular system. The electrical impulse stimulates the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium into the sarcomere area. The calcium allows the actin, myosin, and ATP to interact, causing bridge formation and muscle contraction. This process continues as long as calcium is available to actin and myosin. Thus the reason calcium is so important in our diet. Muscle relaxation occurs when calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum away from the actin and myosin. So that causes muscle relaxation. When calcium moves in this way, the actin and myosin cannot interact and the muscle relaxes. So it would be best if you take your notes and diagram this out. It is in your book, but you really need to understand that process. Muscle origin and insertion refers to the sites of muscle attachment. Most muscles cross or span at least one joint. When muscles contract, one bone remains relatively stationary or immovable. The origin of the muscle attaches to the stationary bone, whereas the insertion attaches to the more movable bone. So the origin is the part of the bone that remains stationary. The insertion is the part that is more movable. Although most movement is accomplished through the cooperation of muscles, a single muscle is generally responsible for most of the movement. The chief muscle is called the prime mover. Assisting the prime mover are the helper muscles, or synergists. Synergists are said to work with other muscles. So synergy means you work together. So synergists are said to work with other muscles. In contrast, the antagonists are muscles that oppose the action of another muscle. For example, the contraction of the biceps brachiflexus in the forearm at the elbow. The triceps brachii is the antagonist. It opposes the actions of the biceps brachii by extending the forearm. And then there's some terms for overuse and underuse. You should know now hypertrophy means muscles that are increased in size, and you'll hear about cardiac hypertrophy. So the cardiac muscle has increased in size due to sometimes overuse. I have a friend that has lifted weights his whole life, and his heart is enlarged, and it's called hypertrophy. And the physician told him he could never lift weights again, which I found very interesting. The next term is atrophy, and we all know that. If muscles are not used, they will waste away and decrease in size. Contracture is if a muscle is immobilized for a prolonged period of time, it may produce a contracture, which is an abnormal formation of fibrous tissues within the muscle, and it can freeze in place. Therefore, it's so important as a nurse that we move our patients, move their joints. If they are non-responsive, we do passive range of motion on them so that they don't get contractures. Please look at the muscles of the body on table 9.1. Study these various muscles, especially the muscles of the neck and trunk. Know the function, location, and description. Know the rotator cuff muscles and muscles that move the thigh and the leg. It's a little hint for you, but you make sure you know the muscles of the neck and trunk, their function, location, and their description. Know the rotator cuff muscles and the muscles that move the thigh and the leg. Also study figure 911 and know the different muscles there. One is called the kissing muscle, the trumpeter's muscle, the smiling muscle, the swimmer's muscle, the surprised muscle, etc. And as always, study the medical terminology and disorders at the end of the chapter. And I hope this quick video will help you as you're studying the chapter. Thank you.